Professor of Economics at the Norwegian School of Economics in Bergen, Norway. Born and raised in Iceland, he received his PhD from the University of Lund, Sweden in 1974. His main research interests are fisheries economics and petroleum. He's been visiting professor at universities in the US, Australia, and Germany, and consultant to the Food and Agricultural Organization of the UN, the OECD, and the World Bank. I first discovered Professor Hannesson when I read his delightful little book entitled Investing for Sustainability, the Management of Petroleum Wealth, which discusses how 4 different places have tried to translate the concept of economic sustainability into practice. And I knew I was in for a good read, interesting read, when I saw the opening quote from the book from Henry George, which is as follows. "It is a well-provisioned ship, this on which we sail through space. If the bread and beef above decks seems to be scarce, but we have but to open a hatch, and there is a new supply, of which before we had never dreamed. And very great command over the services of others comes to those who, as the hatches are opened, are permitted to say, 'This is mine.'" And I think it's clear to say that the Norwegians have figured out how to say, "This is mine." Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Scott, for your very nice introduction. Norway's savings of its oil money has been widely acclaimed as a success. And it is. But there are 2 sides to every coin, and both of them may not be equally shiny. And towards the end of my talk, I'm going to mention some problems that we actually have had related to our savings of the oil money. I'll give you some background to begin with. As late as 1960, it was considered very unlikely that there was any oil underneath the North Sea. And there was no Norwegian oil industry and no expertise whatsoever about petroleum. The first oil was found by an American company, Phillips of Oklahoma, and that happened in 1969. The concern at the time was that this might not even be profitable. This was the time when the price of oil was $2 per barrel. That is, of course, more than today's money, but even so, fairly cheap. Now, very soon after, we got the first energy crisis, and with the quadrupling of oil prices, and that made the North Sea at least comfortably profitable. And not very long after, the tax regime was changed, and I suppose we ever since have had some of the highest tax rates of petroleum in the world. Now, here's a sort of a timeline of the revenues from the petroleum extraction. This all started in the early to mid 1970s, and in 1986 came the collapse of oil prices. The net cash flow to the government almost became zero. I should mention that the government revenue from oil comes from 2 sources really, 3 sources as a matter of fact. One is taxation, and the other is profit sharing with the oil companies. And the third is the dividend of Statoil, which is actually very small and almost negligible compared to the other 2. Now, what was going on around 1990 was that the government was paying its share of the development costs. So that made the net cash flow from the petroleum revenues almost zero. Now, for quite a long time, there was very little discussion about saving the oil money. There was some discussion about the petroleum fund, but that discussion was for a long time very much about what you might call a rainy day fund. to even out the fluctuations in oil prices. Fairly late, actually, came the idea that we needed to build up this fund to preserve the wealth of the petroleum. People realized that oil money isn't just like any other money. It's wealth, and if you want to preserve the wealth, the very first thing you have to do is to transform it into renewable wealth. And that can only be done by investment, and the way this was done was to establish this investment fund. Now that happened in 1990, and after 1990, in the mid-1990s, the cash flow from petroleum started to increase, and it increased mightily early this century. Now to begin with, there was no rule really about how much money should be put into this fund. The money put into the fund was quite simply the surplus on the consolidated government budget. And that was done because, after all, no government can save more money than corresponds to its consolidated surplus. But when the revenues started to increase early this century, people started to think about, well, we'd better perhaps have some rule or guidance about how much money we should be saving. And that's when the savings rule came into effect, which I will speak about shortly. But as you can see from this diagram, you can see that the revenues from the oil money, from the oil industry, the government revenues have been close to 30% for a number of years now. Now that is calculated on the basis of the central government revenues. If you take the entire public sector, this number would be a little lower. Well, I put up here 3 savings rules. The capital R is the net revenue flow from the oil. The lowercase r is the rate of interest, and the W is the oil wealth. And the first rule is usually or often called Hicks permanent income rule, which says that you can consume an amount equal to the rate of interest that you can earn on your investment times your wealth. And the difference, of course, is what you need to save. Now, it may make more sense to preserve the oil wealth on a per capita basis, and if that's what you do, you will have to subtract the rate of population growth, and that gets me to the second rule. What you can then consume is the rate of interest less the rate of population growth times your wealth. And that's your total wealth. That's the wealth of oil in the ground plus the wealth that you have already invested. Now, the Norwegian savings rule is really a variant of the Hicks permanent income rule, but the difference is that the wealth is only the wealth that has already been invested in the petroleum fund. It ignores the wealth of the oil in the ground, which then of course means that initially we would be saving everything, but over time, as the wealth in the ground is depleted, the savings rule and the Hicks rule would converge. So according to the savings rule, we should be saving actually more than we need in order to preserve the entire wealth. But on the other hand, the savings rule put together in 2001 ignores population growth, and which is a bit funny because the population growth in Norway has not been negligible lately anyway. For the last 20 years we have had something like a population growth of 0.9%. I think this is one of the highest in Europe. And about half of it, roughly I think, is immigration. Much of that from European countries, but also people from elsewhere. Now here's a comparison of these 3 rules. The blue line is the Hicksian permanent income rule with the adjustment for population growth. And the green line, it looks green to me. The green line is what we should have been saving according to the savings rule. And as you can see, and as I have already said, the savings rule is a lot more ambitious than what we really need to preserve this petroleum wealth. Now, if we compare the savings rule with what actually has happened, we have the red line, which shows us the actual savings. And what you can see from there is that the savings rule has actually been followed fairly well over a long period of time. It was never the intention to apply the savings rule unmodified every year. Because after all, well, the thing I learned back in those days when I went to school was that if you have different goals with your budget, you should have at least as many instruments as you have targets. So to apply that here, the public budget, of course, has many purposes, and one important one is macroeconomic stability, macroeconomic stabilization, and add that to this objective of preserving the wealth, and then, of course, the savings rule would not be able to achieve both of those objectives at the same time. We need to spend more money in bad years and then less in good years, but over time, the savings rule should hold, roughly. And that seems to be what has happened. Now, I should add that if the oil price would still be $20, I'm not entirely sure how well this savings program would have fared, but that's another issue. This is how the petroleum wealth has developed. You can see how the wealth in the fund has grown pretty nicely. Over the years, the wealth in the ground has also grown, even though we are depleting, particularly our oil reserves. But the reason for this growth is the increase in oil prices. Now, lately, the wealth in the ground has fallen because oil prices haven't been increasing much lately, but they're still at a nice level. Now I come to the downside of this savings program. It seems that politicians have been clever enough to keep the total expenditure under control. But what they have very little control over is how the money is spent. And what we can see from this is that the expenditures on disability and sick leave have increased almost exponentially over the last 15 years or so. Whereas expenditures on infrastructure, roads and railways, things like that, at least what is spent by the central government, that's the lowest line you can see here, that's been fairly stagnant. What saves today is expenditures by municipalities and not least road taxes, road tolls that have been increased substantially over the years. So there is a grain of truth in saying that we have been saving this oil money at the expense of investing in our own infrastructure. And perhaps by raising a special tax on people who drive cars and trucks. That's not the whole story, of course, but there's a bigger grain of truth in it than I think is common. Now, is this a specifically Norwegian problem? Well, let's go to our neighbors and see what's happened there. In the upper left corner, we see the sickness and disability payments in Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. And we see that the Swedes actually have been able to reduce their expenditures on sick leave and disability quite impressively since about 2004 or 5, something about that. In Denmark, these expenditures have increased up to quite recently. Lately, the Danes seem to be making an effort to reduce these expenditures. And the way the Swedes at least have done it is that their sick leave payments are nowhere near as generous as ours. Our people, they get full pay from day one if they get sick. It's not quite that generous next door. I don't remember the figures, but another figure I remember is that the Swedes are about, we're about twice as sick as the Swedes are. And I don't think that the difference in public health is really of that magnitude. So there's an economic factor in all this. Now, if you look at investment in roads and railways, Norway and Denmark are fairly similar. The Swedes have invested quite considerably in their infrastructure, roads and railways, about twice what we do, which is not surprising because there are twice as many people living in Sweden as there are in Norway. But even so, they've been able to maintain their investment in infrastructure at the same time as they have been able to reduce the payments on sickness and disability. And well, one reason why I mention this as a problem is that one of the intentions with the petroleum fund and the savings rule was to avoid unsustainable welfare payments. Now, whether these payments will turn out to be sustainable or not, we will only know in the future. Well, this story raises for me three questions of principal importance. One is how much can cleverly designed institutions achieve? And when I'm talking about cleverly designed institutions, I'm talking about things like independent central banks, which were put together in order to take the punch bowl from the politicians and make sure that inflation was under control on the background of the rather sad experiences of the 1970s and early 80s. And the Norwegian Oil Fund is one of such clever institutions. It's supposed to enable us to maintain our petroleum wealth. And yes, we have achieved that. But there have also been some downsides to that savings program that I've already mentioned. So point number two is that it's difficult to separate the use of oil money from the general economic and political perspectives. Now, politicians have no direct control over how much money is going into disability and sickness payments. The labor unions are quite strong in Norway, and the reason is that the economy is a full employment economy. There's pressure in the labor market. And this program of the sick leave payments is off limits for all political parties. No political party dares take up this issue because the labor unions have made this into a flag issue. Another thing is that many of the payments for disability are due to high wage rates, and a policy which tries to increase the minimum wage. We do have quite a number of people who are not very highly skilled and not easily employable, and there are just no employers who would employ them for the wage rates that we have. And the way out of that is that even young people who have never been in the labor market are put on disability payments, and they are pretty sure to stay there for the rest of their life, many of them. So this is all, in my view, grounded in the perception that we are pretty damned rich. We can afford to allow ourselves certain extravagances that we couldn't otherwise do. And it's very difficult for public policy to deal with this kind of perception. And then finally, the final point I will make is the question whether the Norwegian experience is anything for poor countries to emulate. There is a cottage industry of giving advice to many developing countries about what they could do with their oil wealth. And people are saying, look at us, look at what we have achieved. You should do something similar. Well, that's fine. Well, what do poor developing countries need? They don't need paper wealth on Wall Street. They need investment in productive equipment, infrastructure, and things like that. Now, of course, putting oil tax revenues into a fund could be a vehicle to achieve that kind of thing. On the second round, that money is invested in infrastructure, companies, or whatever. But who's going to make that decision? If you have a country that is fairly corrupt, with a fairly corrupt elite, I'm pretty sure that that elite would find a way to use the oil money in the fund in not so productive purposes. Just to mention an example, I think that Venezuela has a petroleum fund, has a sovereign wealth fund. But what to do with the money, I guess no one of us really can answer. But we have our suspicions. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Melville McMillan, Professor Emeritus in the Department of Economics and a Fellow of the Institute of Public Economics at the University of Alberta in Edmonton. He received his PhD from Cornell and was on the faculty of the University of Wisconsin before returning to Canada and joining the University of Alberta. He has also been a visitor at the Australian National University and the University of York, as well as advisor to governments and organizations within Canada and internationally, such as the World Bank. His research interests are in public economics, urban and local economics, fiscal federalism, and the demand for and supply of public goods and services. And I first met Professor McMillan when we shared the podium at a conference on the Alberta Heritage Savings Trust Fund in Edmonton, I believe, in 1979, at which he presented a paper with the provocative title, Province Building versus Rentier Society, which concluded, I think, with the suggestion that Alberta should consider privatization of the economic rents from petroleum through the use of a dividend. I don't think that happened in Alberta. Alaska went ahead with that suggestion, thank you. But maybe we'll hear a little bit more about that from Professor McMillan.
Well, thank you very much, Scott. And no, that did not happen in Alberta. we weren't able to take the lead, or to follow the lead of Alaska by any means. Okay, as already mentioned, when a country has natural resource revenues or significant natural resource revenues, there's a bit of a problem. And that problem has to do with, do you spend it all? Do you save it all? Do you find some kind of balance in terms of savings and spending? Or, and then the second question or second problem is, how do you deal with natural resource volatility? And we've already seen that in both of these issues in the case of Norway, and of course Alberta has faced this. And just in the context of natural resource volatility, or revenue volatility, non-renewable resource revenues in Alberta have ranged between 15 and about 50% of the provincial budget. So there's a lot of movement there. So both are problems. Alberta, of course, like Norway, faced this problem in the early 70s when OPEC was first exercising its influence on energy prices. And by 1976, it was rather awash in cash. And it established the Heritage Savings Trust Fund as a mechanism for saving some of the resource revenues. The plan was that it would save 30% of natural resource revenues and allocate those into the Heritage Savings Trust Fund, of which it had at the time 3 investment divisions. And as it indicated, there's a plan, or the trust fund was conceived as a relatively multi-purpose type of fund. The Alberta Investment Division would invest in almost anything that was seen to improve the well-being of Albertans. The Capital Investment division was to invest in things in Alberta that would be infrastructure related. The Canada Investment Division was to basically lending to other provinces and agents of other provinces at somewhat concessionary interest rates, so for both financial and somewhat political reasons. There was also thoughts of that this would serve as a rainy day fund, and that it would also serve to diversify the economy. So it had often broad and somewhat conflicting objectives. This particular and kind of relatively messy figure summarizes essentially Alberta's experience in saving natural resource revenues. So we'll look at the saving side of this, and the blue line. Oops, excuse me. Where's the? There we go. The blue line here is the natural resource revenues that have accrued to the provincial government, and those are in nominal dollars, so they reflect price change and production changes over time. This is going from 1972-73 to the latest fiscal year, and so that has roughly trended upwards. The red line here is the contributions that went into the Alberta Heritage Savings Trust Fund. Those started off at 30% of natural resource revenues, and all the income that was earned by the fund was retained in the fund at that time. That lasted 7 years. And by that time, expenditures had caught up with revenues. The provincial government decided that it would take all the revenues that were earned by the fund, all the investment earnings, put those into the general revenue fund, and it would only contribute 15% to the of natural resource revenues to the fund. That lasted 4 years, and by that time there's some considerable collapse in natural resource revenues, and there were no longer any contributions made to the Heritage Savings Trust Fund. The non-contributions, or very small contributions, essentially existed for a very long period of time. And then we get over here into 2002, and there's another resource boom. And at that time, there's a new fund established, and this fund is called the Sustainability Fund. The Sustainability Fund was designed to be a rainy day fund. And what it did was accumulate a lot of savings when the resource boom was going on well, and then the rainy day came and the savings dropped, and in fact they were withdrawals from the fund for the last 4 years, and those have been fairly substantial withdrawals. Now, during the lush times, there were some contributions again made to the Heritage Savings Trust Fund, and the green dots here indicate sporadic attempts to inflation-proof the Heritage Fund by retaining enough of the earnings in the fund to make up or compensate for inflation, that is, maintain the real value. You can see that has been rather sporadic. And then there's occasionally some other funds that have been endowments that have been made into other funds. So if you put all that together, this is the total amount of savings on an annual basis that has occurred from the natural resource revenues. This is the major savings funds. No need to really pay much attention to this, other than to note that the Alberta Heritage Savings Trust Fund is 80% of the total funds that have been saved, and monies have gone into other good things like medical research and scholarships and so on. The Sustainability Fund is the other big player currently, and as of 2008-2009, it had almost $17 billion accumulated in it, which is roughly half of the provincial budget at the time. And but as I indicated, the rainy day arrived, and as of the end of the last fiscal year, this was $2.8 billion, It's predicted to go to about 0.7 billion, and this is now an optimistic forecast. It's probably going to be depleted entirely, other than perhaps some, if there's not some fiddling in budget categories and so on. AIMCO, I'll skip over that. We can talk about that at some point if you like. This is the total amount of savings out of the natural resource revenues. There's been about $212 billion of natural resource revenues. We have savings out of that of roughly 25. If you look at it in terms of net financial assets, because we again have some debt, it's less than that. So we've saved about 10% of the natural resource revenues that the province has received, which some might say was good and some might say was not so good. Despite all that savings and dissaving and not saving and so on, the fluctuations that we've had, which have provided, are a way of rather ad hoc and perhaps pretty not very logical way of dealing with fluctuations in resource revenue or resource revenue volatility. It has not saved Albertans from also going into debt. They ran a series of deficits here in the early 80s, ran into a negative net financial asset position. That is, the debts of the province exceeded the assets that we had, including the trust fund. Lots of savings, and again, some withdrawals and negative savings. And we currently have some debt in addition to that, or in addition. So debt has still come to play a role, fairly significant role. In addition to that, Alberta has been innovative in doing some cash disbursements. There were, in 2000 and 2001, there were two payments of $150 each made to individuals 16 years of age and over, and that cost about $0.7 billion. And then in 2006, there was a resource rebate of $400 per capita to everyone in the province who wasn't in a prison, and that cost $1.3 billion. And then in addition to that, there's been some subsidies for natural gas when the natural gas prices were high, and